All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the incredibly high stakes, literally deadly, game of Ottoman royal succession. And we're going to do it by tracing the absolute roller coaster life of one specific man, Sem Sultan. Trust me, his story is unbelievable.
Now, to really wrap our heads around this brutal winner-takes-all scenario, we have to look back at the Turco-Mongol tradition of open succession. See, unlike European monarchies where the oldest son just automatically inherits everything, the early Ottoman state operated on this concept of shared patrimony. Basically, every single prince had an equal divine right to rule. There was no guaranteed heir. So imagine this. What happens when losing a political campaign doesn't just mean a quiet retirement, but actually means death? Well, historically speaking, this open system practically guaranteed a massive civil war every single time a sultan died. It was chaos. Because of this, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the guy who took Constantinople, decided to formalize a pretty drastic solution. He legalized fratricide. He used a legal doctrine known as Nizam-i-Alem, which translates to the order of the world. This wasn't just a casual suggestion, right? It was an explicit legal doctrine allowing and honestly almost expecting a new sultan to execute his own brothers just to protect the stability of the state.
Let's look a little closer at this law of fratricide. This law totally flipped Ottoman politics into a literal race where second place meant the grave. The luckiest, most powerful prince, the one who managed to seize the capital and win over the military, was fully expected to execute his male relatives. Now I know, to our modern sensibilities, this sounds absolutely horrific, but let's look at how it was viewed back then. Scholars at the time justified this bitter poison as a completely necessary evil. Their logic was super pragmatic. It stopped endless bloody civil wars, it kept the empire unified so princes couldn't just splinter off and form their own kingdoms, and it protected everyday people from years of political chaos. Above all else, it ensured that only the absolute most capable, battle-tested leader took the throne. It was literally survival of the fittest, but on an imperial scale.
So, how did this play out in reality? That brings us to a kingdom divided.
In 1481, Mehmed II dies, triggering a frantic, deadly sprint to the capital of Istanbul between two of his sons. And this is where our main guy, Cem Sultan, steps right into the crosshairs. When you compare the two rival brothers, the stakes are crystal clear. Bayezid was older, governing from Amasya, and he had the heavy-hitting backing of the Janissary military corps and influential pashas. Cem, on the other hand, was the younger brother. He was known as this popular poet, and crucially, his governorship in Konya was geographically a lot closer to the capital. The Grand Vizier secretly tried to use that distance to his advantage, attempting to sneak Cem into Istanbul first. But the Janissaries sniffed out the plot. They actually lynched the Grand Vizier, and they rapidly crowned the older brother, Bayezid II.
But Sem, he wasn't about to just sit around and wait for the executioner. Refusing to surrender, he rounded up an army of 4,000 men, captured the historic city of Bursa, and boldly declared himself the Sultan of Anatolia. Then, he sent a desperate, but, kind of pragmatic proposal to his newly crowned brother. He basically said, hey, let's just divide the empire in half. I'll take the Asian side, you keep the European side. And what happened next brilliantly illustrates the utterly ruthless rules of this game. Bayezid was furious. He rejected the offer with this chilling response. There is no mercy among the sultans. Between rulers, there is no kinship. Wow. With that absolute mic drop of a declaration, Bayezid marched his forces straight on Bursa and decisively crushed Sem's army, which turned Sem into the exiled prince.
So, Cem lost the succession, but unlike the brothers who came before him, he actually managed to escape. He fled first to the Mamluk Sultanate in Cairo, and fun fact, Cem became the only Ottoman prince in history to ever make the pilgrimage to Mecca. But his political ambitions, far from over. While he was in Cairo, Bayezid offered him this massive 1 million akshay bribe just to step down and live out a quiet, luxurious life in Jerusalem. Cem flat out rejected it. Instead, in 1482, he launched one last desperate military campaign in Anatolia. But after suffering another crushing defeat at Konya, and with all his routes back to Egypt completely blocked, Cem was in real trouble. He was forced to seek asylum, fleeing to the island of Rhodes and throwing himself at the mercy of a Catholic order known as the Knights Hospitaller. And just like that, Sem becomes Europe's most valuable hostage. Cem actually offered the Knights perpetual peace with Christendom if they would just help him win back his throne. But the Grand Master of the Knights,
he was playing a totally different game. He secretly realized that actually going to war with Bayezid was a terrible idea, but keeping Cem as a hostage, now that was incredibly profitable. The timeline of his captivity is just a story of tragic betrayal. The knights took Bayezid's money and completely sold Cem out. For the next 13 years, European powers essentially passed this poor poet prince around like a geopolitical trading card. He was locked up in a fortified tower in France for years before they transferred him to Rome, straight into the custody of Pope Innocent VIII. European leaders constantly used the threat of letting Cem loose to scare Bayezid out of launching military campaigns into Christian Europe.
The hostage economics going on here were absolutely staggering. We are talking 120,000 crowns. Sultan Bayezid paid Pope Innocent VIII that insane sum, which, to put into perspective, was equal to all of the Pope's other annual revenues combined, just to keep his brother locked up in Rome. The Sultan even threw in a supposed relic of the Holy Lands and tens of thousands of annual ducats just to sweeten the deal and maintain the arrangement.
And here is a jaw-dropping piece of historical irony. Because of these massive, continuous Ottoman bribes meant to keep a Muslim prince behind bars, the Vatican was practically swimming in cash, and a huge chunk of that very money actually went toward funding the construction of the Sistine Chapel. Wild, right?
Sane's tragic, globe-trotting nightmare finally came to an end in 1495. The French king, Charles VIII, invaded Italy, took over Naples, and forced the new pope, the infamous Alexander VI, a Borgia, to hand Sam over. But shortly after getting taken by the French army, Sam died in Naples. He was only 35, and to this day, rumors still swirl that the Borgia pope secretly poisoned him before the handover, simply because he couldn't stomach giving up his most valuable hostage alive.
Now, get this. Upon hearing about the death of the very brother he had paid a literal fortune to imprison and had actively tried to assassinate, Sultan Bayezid declared 3 days of national mourning. I know, the hypocrisy is stunning, but the indignities for Sem still weren't over. European powers actually kept extorting Bayezid using Sem's corpse for another 4 years before they finally handed his body over for a proper Islamic burial in Bursa. Eventually, all of this led to the creation of the Gilded Cage. Sem's horrific life story perfectly highlights the absolute nightmare of the open succession system. But, society can only stomach so much bloodshed. Over a century later, public outrage over these royal executions forced a massive institutional shift in the Ottoman Empire. The breaking point? That came in 1595, when Sultan Mehmed III absolutely horrified the people of Istanbul by executing 19 of his brothers, many of them literal infants, in a single day. Seeing 19 tiny coffins paraded out of the palace, it was just too much. So, in 1603, Sultan Ahmed I finally changed the rules. He spared his younger brother, ended the practice of fratricide, and shifted the whole empire to a system of seniority succession.
But of course, they didn't just let these princes roam free. No way. Instead of sending them to the grave, princes were now sent to the kafes, which literally translates to the cage. These were lavish apartments deep inside the imperial harem, where potential successors were kept under luxurious but absolute lifelong house arrest. They were completely cut off from the outside world, denied any sort of provincial governorships, and kept under 24/7 surveillance just to make sure they couldn't stage a rebellion. And this brings us to the ultimate historical trade-off of the Ottoman Empire. The law of fratricide was undeniably brutal, sure, but it guaranteed that only capable, experienced, battle-tested leaders took the throne. The kafes system, on the other hand, successfully preserved royal lives and put an end to the civil wars. But what was the cost? It produced a lineage of isolated, wildly inexperienced, and honestly, psychologically damaged sultans who had literally never seen the real world outside their palace walls. Over time, these sheltered, weak rulers created a power vacuum that severely undermined the Ottoman state. Which leaves us with this final, fascinating historical paradox. The tragic saga of Cem Sultan shows us exactly why the Ottomans felt they had to abandon their brutal ways. But we have to ask ourselves, in trying to humanize a ruthless system just to save the lives of men like Cem, did the Ottoman Empire inadvertently seal its own collapse? It's a profound question about the cost of power, and one I really hope leaves you wanting to explore more about this incredible era of history.